Hello everyone. The purpose of this video lecture is to help prepare you for the readings from Andrew Carnegie and Karl Marx. The purpose for reading Carnegie and Marx is to prepare you for reading Rerum Novarum, which will be covered over the next few class sessions. Simply put, this video lecture is preparation for the preparation. By the end of today's reading and the class discussion on the reading, you should have a solid understanding of the situation that Pope Leo XIII and his encyclical Rerum Novarum is addressing. What is this situation? Boiled down to bare concepts, this situation involves the effects of industrial capitalism. In addressing these effects, there are defenders of industrial capitalism, such as Andrew Carnegie. There are also critics of industrial capitalism, of which Karl Marx is the extreme example. I say extreme example because, as you will read in the next few classes, Leo XIII is also critical of these effects, though in a way that is also very critical of Marx and communism. This leads to the question, what is being criticized? In contemporary discussion, terms like capitalism and communism, socialism, or even social justice are often used as abstractions and often out of context. Therefore, especially for these readings, it is important to have a better sense of the context that they were written in and the situation they are writing about. For example, the capitalism experienced by U.S. citizens today is not the capitalism experienced in the 19th century when these works were written. Furthermore, the communism of Marx is not exactly the communism found in the USSR or in China today. This is not to say that they are completely different. There are significant, even direct relationships in both examples, for better or worse. Instead, it is only to point out that in order to understand Carnegie or Marx, industrial capitalism, or Marxist criticism, it is important to try to understand them in their context and through their own thoughts. Even if one ends up criticizing their perspectives, that criticism will be better off because it will be from an intelligent understanding of their positions, not caricatures or misrepresentations. More importantly, the criticism of both that will be encountered in the next few days from Leo XIII comes from a careful analysis of both communism and the effects of industrial capitalism. Before moving on to some pointers on reading the foretext, let me give you two illustrations that will help you understand the situation these texts are describing. The first illustration is one that you are all probably familiar with. This comes from Charles Dickens' classic story, A Christmas Carol. It is worth noting that Dickens, like Marx and Carnegie, was writing within and about the effects of industrial capitalism. Of course, you all know that the main character of A Christmas Carol is Ebenezer Scrooge. Throughout most of the story, Scrooge is a pretty bad guy. At the same time, nowhere in the book does Scrooge do anything overtly wrong. He doesn't rob anyone at gunpoint. He doesn't kill anyone. He doesn't lie or cheat. He doesn't live an extravagant lifestyle. On the contrary, Scrooge lives like a hermit. So then, why is Scrooge such a bad guy? Mostly it is because of how he treats his employee, Bob Cratchit. He doesn't pay him enough to feed his family or care for his sick son, Tiny Tim. He makes him work on Christmas. In a word, Scrooge treats Bob Cratchit unfairly. He treats him like an object. He doesn't treat him like a human being. In spite of the fact that Scrooge doesn't lie, cheat, or steal, he is considered a bad guy because he doesn't treat his employee as a person, but as a mechanism to help him get more money. While this is, of course, an exaggeration, it is fiction after all. Scrooge is representative of all of the dangers of capitalism run amok, or at least that is what Dickens and Marx thought. But as you will read, Carnegie, the great industrial capitalist, was aware of just this possibility. For the second illustration, imagine this scenario. Say your group number 1 or group number 2, or Snooky, are all barely below a B for the semester. In fact, one more point in group work will give you a B in the class. Of course, this is fictional, since I am sure all of you are doing much better than that, but just imagine. Okay, you need to get a B or you will lose your scholarship. You and your group ask your professor if there's anything you can do. After a moment, she or he says, okay, if you get together and write a 10-page paper about Hildegard of Bingen that is insightful and brilliant, I will give you all 1 point. You have a week. Although you all think that this is a lot of work for one group work point, you all really need the B, so you agree. You work at night and over the weekend, you neglect your social life, you forget to call your parents, you skip meals. It is a hard week, but in the end you produce a really brilliant essay about Hildegard. Before class, you turn it into your professor, who has you sign a piece of paper that says he now owns what you just wrote. If you don't sign it, you don't get the point, so you sign it. And the professor says, congratulations, you all get your 1 point. Even though you're exhausted and still questioning if 1 point was worth all that effort, you are somewhat relieved because you got the bare minimum of what you needed. Now, at the end of class, the professor announces, hey everyone, I just sold an article on Hildegard of Bingen for $500. You and your group are surprised and angry that your professor got $500 and you got 1 measly group work point. After class, you confront the professor and say that you should at least get part of the money. The professor says, look, you agreed to the terms and you signed the contract. The paper is mine. It always was mine, and you got what I said I would give you. It was fair. Even though everything he said is basically true, you probably think that this was an unfair situation. You probably think that the professor was unjust. You probably think that it is wrong that someone made all of that money off of all of your work, and all you got was a measly group work point. You probably think that this was unfair because you were treated like an object, and everything you did that you worked hard for, that you poured yourself into, was taken away because your professor took advantage of your needs. According to Marx, that feeling is called estrangement or alienation. It is an important term for your readings on Marx, so keep the example in mind when you are reading. That being said, let me give you a couple of notes on the text you are reading. First of all, you should read them in this order. Carnegie on wealth. The piece on the homestead strike. Marx on estranged labor. Marx on religion. Okay. So for Carnegie on wealth, pay attention to how Carnegie is sensitive to the negative effects of capitalism, why he thinks they are unavoidable, and what he thinks the wealthy should do about it. Most of all, think of how Carnegie thinks that the caste system produced by industrial capitalism is a tragic inevitability. For the piece on the homestead strike, pay attention to how the tragic inevitability actually works in relationship to the factory workers in Carnegie's steel mill. Specifically, pay attention to how Carnegie and his employee, Henry Frick, treat the workers. Pay attention to what the workers really wanted. Ask if Carnegie's regrets about the events of the homestead strike change his views in a way that would really prevent it from happening again. For Marx on estranged labor, this is the most difficult text that you will be reading. Pay attention to what Marx says about the assumptions of capitalism. Think about how Carnegie fundamentally agrees with these assumptions, and think about how the phrase free to work or starve might summarize this text. Most of all, while you're reading about estrangement and alienation, try to relate it to the greedy professor and your exploited group. With 2 big exceptions. First, the workers here in the steel mill are like the factory workers you will read about in the homestead strike. Second, the payment they receive is not extra credit, but barely enough to support themselves and their families. And as you will see, sometimes not even that. The last piece you will be reading is Marx on religion. This is where Marx makes the statement, religion is the opiate of the masses. Actually, he doesn't quite say that, but he says something very close. Remember what Pope Benedict said in Deus Caritas Est about how Marx critiques Christian charity. Specifically, think about how Marx is saying that religion gives people the illusion of happiness or justice instead of real happiness or justice. Now, before you reject Marx in this section, think about this. Carnegie considered himself a Christian. He gathered a lot of wealth from a lot of workers that he paid very little. He then turned around and gave them stuff, like bowling alleys, in the name of Christian charity. The Christian charity he gave his workers came from the money he made from their own work that he paid them very little for. So ask yourself, is this truly Christian charity? If it is truly Christian charity, then is Marx wrong to say that religion keeps people blind to their own unjust circumstances? Or is it true that Christian charity, that agape, is something more, something else, and something better that can challenge both Carnegie and Marx? Thanks, and good luck.